I'm Jim Knight, co-founder of the Instructional Coaching Group, and you're listening to Coaching Conversations, where I talk with coaching experts from around the world so that all of us can learn better ways to make an unmistakably positive impact on the people around us. So I'm so looking forward to our conversation. You know, I've been super excited about the chance to learn with you, but then it turns out you're just a heck of a nice guy, and it's just been really fun just to work with you and sharing our interests and everything from Australian rules football to the Smiths. So I'm so
likewise, Jim. Likewise.
I'm so grateful to have a chance to talk with you. We're working on a book, which hopefully we'll have put together on instructional coaching for classroom instruction, the new classroom instruction that works. And I'm so excited about how the science of learning, science of teaching, and the research, I'm not quite ready to say the science of coaching, but the research on coaching and the work we do on coaching all comes together. And so I'm grateful to have you on this conversation.
I'm so glad to be here, Jim. I've been learning a lot from you as well. And we're excited too about the idea of really wrapping coaching around these strategies. We know that's actually where the magic happens. That's how we get teachers to change practice, is by working with them and helping them do all the things that you talk about, setting goals and tracking progress, all those things. So really excited about this too.
So your organization, McREL, is probably one of the most important research organizations in the United States. Could you kind of give us just a little bit of a background on what McREL is, its history, and the whole thing? And I think most people in the United States and other countries as well around the world are pretty familiar with McREL, but just on the off chance somebody isn't, maybe you could share a bit about it.
Sure. Yeah, we've been around a long time. We were incorporated in 1966, which predates my existence on this planet. But the idea of so McREL was incorporated to be one of the 10 regional educational laboratories, and the idea was that we've got a lot of research that's happening all the time. Even back in 1966, there was a lot that was happening, but oftentimes it was tied up in academic journals and not making its way into the hands of teachers. And so McREL and the other labs were set up to how do we translate this really good research into practical application? And we're still around now, 58 years later, because actually the research has gotten more sophisticated. There's a lot more we know about from cognitive science, and the research itself is becoming increasingly scientific, using randomized control trial and other kinds of methodologies where we've got treatment groups, control groups, all that stuff. So McREL is still focused on that. How do we help people translate what has really kind of been a renaissance of research and education into the practical things? What do I do Monday morning in my classroom? And that's kind of where we sit, kind of as those boundary spanners, both doing the research, but then having a lot of folks on staff who know what classrooms look like, who have lots of classroom experience, leadership experience, and so forth. And so I like to think that's kind of like our chocolate and peanut butter, right? It's the research side of the house with the technical assistance side. My job is basically just to coordinate the two, and sometimes just get out of the way, let people do good work, right?
That's a good strategy. Maybe, if you don't mind, could you share a bit about your role at McREL? And also, it's just some of your publications. We're going to talk about the new classroom instruction that works, but what about the other books?
Yeah. So I've been writing a lot of books over a long period of time, and essentially it's distilling McREL's research. And so my background was as a teacher, as a journalist, and so I kind of combined those two things in my writing. But I've written books. One was the first one I wrote for ASCD. Primarily, I write with ASCD. Wrote a book called Simply Better, and we had just done a huge synthesis of hundreds of research studies on what are the key leverage points for improving school systems. And that became the book Simply Better, which was really 5 key leverage points for improving school outcomes. Written books around leadership. We have a program called Balanced Leadership at McREL, written books on that. Written a lot of books on curiosity. I've also written books on, one book was back in the day called The 12 Touchstones of Good Teaching. What does it mean to be a good teacher? Again, taking lots of research and saying, can we boil it down to essential, strategies, essential things that we should be focusing on. I always think about trying to find the simplicity on the far side of complexity. Mm-hmm. And I think that's kind of what this latest book is trying to do, the new classroom instruction that works. Looking at brain science, how we know the process of learning works, but then also we were looking at 105 studies that we found. I'll talk more about that later, but we found, scientific studies, and then we were looking at what does that tell teachers they should be focusing on, at least as a starter set of teaching strategies.
So maybe say, if you don't mind, a little bit about the history of the new classroom instruction that works. That book in various formats has been a publication of McREL. So tell us a bit about the background of that book too.
Yeah, so that book actually came out of the laboratory program that I described earlier. Started in 1998. Bob Marzano wrote a research meta-analysis called a theory-based meta-analysis of research on instructional strategies. But I have to credit Bob for this because he really had the insight that, again, there's a lot of research out there. How do we boil it down to the essential things? And so that book then came out. There's a book called Classroom Instruction That Works that we co-published with ASCD in, I think, 2000. And it was sort of the right book at the right time. That book has sold more than 1 million copies worldwide, 17 foreign languages. Really became kind of a phenomenal book that I think for a lot of folks, it almost initiated this era of using research to really guide classroom practice, made it practical, made it accessible for teachers. We had a second edition in 2010 where we updated the research base. This book now, the new Classroom Instruction That Works, we took a slightly different approach where we looked at, in this case, only scientific studies that pass What Works Clearinghouse criteria for rigor. What Works Clearinghouse is a federal database that has really sought to transform teaching into a scientific profession. And so that was a whole new set of studies. And so we took a slightly different approach with that, which I can talk about in a minute. But that's kind of the history of this book. It's been around for a long time. What we didn't want to lose was I think the magic of it has always been helping teachers say, okay, what are the core things I should have in my repertoire? There may be other things later I add, but what things should I have in my back pocket to make sure I'm delivering high quality learning experiences for kids?
So the difference between this and some of the other works is rather than doing a meta-analysis where you look at lots of different studies, you zoned in exclusively on studies that meet the rigorous criteria of What Works Clearinghouse. And you were able to identify like about 100 and some studies that hit the criteria?
Yeah, we found 105 studies. We were looking for studies that were a couple of things. One is that they were focused on instructional strategies. So you can find a lot of strategies that are like, it's a curriculum, right, that a school can implement. Well, for a teacher, I can't do much about my school's curriculum probably unless I'm on the curriculum committee. So we were looking at that. We also want to make sure that the studies were across grade levels, across subject areas, and also representing diverse learners. And so I'm really happy that 70% of the studies in that sample had classrooms with diverse learners. At least 40% of the kids were either identified as, free and reduced lunch. Maybe they were previously low performing. They were multilingual. They were kids of color. So what's great is we don't have to say, we think these strategies are going to work in diverse classrooms. We say, actually, we know they work in diverse classrooms. And a lot of them were showing findings that were closing achievement gaps. The reason that we didn't do a meta-analysis with this one is because these were more sophisticated studies. They tended to be a bundle of interventions or a bundle of strategies put together. So like you might see a researcher saying, I want to try what happens if I help kids set goals and I do some direct instruction, but then I help them also maybe work in teams to, extend that learning into something deeper. So from that, it's like, well, we could see several strategies that work. How do we distill which strategy was the key strategy there? So we decided instead of doing that, we would just say, here's the effect sizes of that study, and here's like the constellation of strategies we saw there. So from that is how we came up with the 14 strategies. We kept seeing in several cases strategies repeat themselves. So every strategy we've identified, we found in at least 7 studies. Again, in diverse classrooms, across grade levels, across subject areas.
I love it. So when we talk about evidence-based, we can feel pretty confident that we have evidence to support the 14 strategies or the stages of instruction you talk about.
Because these are scientific studies, Jim, we can also make causal references, right? We can say, or causal inferences, right? We know that like the treatment group got something that the control group didn't, and we saw gains in the treatment group. And so we don't have to worry about, were there other confounding factors that might be at play here? Students' socioeconomic background or teacher skill, whatever. Like we can actually say these strategies, when applied randomly to a group of kids, had positive outcomes.
So you organized the book. Thank you so much for that explanation. That's just really helpful to sort of get inside how you chose the 14 strategies and the 6 learning phases. And I thought maybe we could organize our talk around those 6 learning phases. And sometimes the questions almost seem a little bit goofy because the obvious, it's just like the first one, for example, is become interested.
Yeah.
And I'm going to ask you, why is that important? But I think we all recognize why it's important. But maybe you could tell us about the research and just your thoughts about why that's important, and what are some things teachers and coaches could do to help get kids interested.
Yeah, yeah. There's the other piece of what's in the new classroom instruction that works is looking at cognitive science. So it's looking at the science of learning, and that's been around for decades. I mean, some of it actually was like at the turn of the last century when we started to figure some things out about how we human beings learn. And so we had a previous book called Learning That Sticks, where we really talked about how could you distill what we know from the science of learning, cognitive psychology, into a simple 6-phase learning model. Now, you know, the old adage, every model is inaccurate. Some are useful. So like a cognitive scientist might say, no, it's actually 17 phases or, or 21, depending on the context, whatever. We were trying to like boil it down for teacher's sake, what would make the most sense. And so when you think about, if you learned anything, and most of the things we learn outside classrooms, right? Anything we've learned or we picked up, we became interested in first, right? There's something piqued our curiosity about it. Something was maybe mysterious about it, or perplexing, where we wanted to learn more. Like if it's a skill, how does that golfer hit that drive so well? I want to learn how to do that myself, right? And so what we also know from this is brain science studies, that if we've learned something because we're curious about it, we're more likely to retain it later. Actually, curiosity appears to prime our brains for learning. So if we're in a state of heightened curiosity, we actually tend to learn things we weren't even trying to learn. So that idea of it seems sometimes like the teachers like it's a nice to have, but it'd be great to have my kids curious. Well, we're saying it's a need to have. If you really want your students to learn something, they have to first become interested in it, have to get their brains switched on to learning. So as obvious as that sounds, I'm sure you see this, Jim, we see this where teachers feel pressed for time and they kind of skip over that. It becomes like, open your books to page 23 and let's get going here. Instead of like, how can I make this learning interesting to you and do what your brain naturally does when it gets switched on to learning? It's like a sponge that's been squeezed and now it's ready to absorb learning. So.
Yeah, we would say it's inside out versus outside in.
And right.
When the person really wants to learn something, your work as a teacher or a coach, in our case, is pretty easy. But if the person doesn't want to learn it, it's going to be really, really difficult.
Yeah.
And so we would say too, you can't force people to learn.
Right.
If they don't want to learn, they're not going to hear it. So so something has to happen where they open themselves up to the learning for it to happen. And that's why I'm thrilled that's the first stage. And the second stage, again, asking why this is important seems kind of silly, but second stage is commit to learn. Tell us about commit to learn, and what are some things we could do to foster committing to learn?
Yeah. So, I mean, if you think about the process, your point too, that we don't learn anything we don't want to, ultimately, right? Or sometimes we trick ourselves into learning something because it's on the test, but what we're trying to get at is intrinsic motivation. But if you think about the process of learning, it requires tremendous mental effort to keep our brains switched on, to keep reminding ourselves, no, this is important, stay focused, keep learning this. Daniel Kahneman is a cognitive scientist. He's one of the greats. Read a book called Thinking Fast and Slow, and his point is that our brains want to go back to kind of revert back to low effort mode all the time. Our brains use the most calories of any other organ in our body, so we want to always kind of step back and take it easy if we can. So learning requires focused mental effort. So how do we keep ourselves convinced we need to learn? We have to commit to learning. And really the way to do that is through goal setting and intrinsic goals, ideally. Like sometimes extrinsic rewards are okay, but primarily it's like I need to, well, Jerry Brophy makes this point. He's also looked at the research on intrinsic motivation. He says the two keys to intrinsic motivation are, first of all, I feel that what I'm being asked to learn is achievable, that I can get there. Not that it's super easy, right? There's a challenge to it, but if I stretch myself, I'll get there. Kind of a Goldilocks zone of challenge, right? But the other piece is that I find it meaningful. I can see what's in it for me. We like to use the Madison Avenue term sometimes. Like, if I know what's in it for me, why this learning is important, I'm more likely to engage in it. And so the strategies there are around helping kids set goals. And so we talk to teachers about, it's great to have learning objectives and learning intentions or know where you're going with the learning. That's necessary, but it's not sufficient until students take your learning intentions and turn them into their goals for learning. And so, again, we saw a ton of studies that found the power of getting kids to set their goals for learning, that take ownership of learning and then finally feel like what I'm being asked to learn is actually something I want to learn, in its own right.
Well, it's interesting the parallels with coaching because we would say exactly the same thing. We're trying to set up a situation, create the conditions where a teacher can identify something they really want to work on, an emotionally compelling goal, and then go after it and hit the goal. And you and I have both talked about how that kind of parallels the research on hope, that hope involves something to hope for, that would be our goal, and then a pathway to the goal, and then belief that we can get there, agency. Those three things seem to be really important. We say coaches foster hope, but I think you can make the same thing for teachers, helping kids identify what they want to work on, see the pathway, and work their way through.
Yeah. And I love what you're getting at there too, Jim, which is we want to create the same conditions for teachers that they ought to be creating for kids, right? And so actually helping teachers see the way that they learn is the way their kids are going to learn, and replicate that in everything we're doing.
Third thing is focus on new learning. Could you tell us about that phase?
Yeah. So if we think about cognitive science for a moment, when learning really starts to happen, it's in our short-term working memory, which is sort of your stream of consciousness, is what you're paying attention to at any given moment. We know that we tend to have visual, we're taking visual stimuli, we're taking verbal stimuli, and we keep going back to our storeroom of prior knowledge as we're learning something. And so there's a few things about that. One thing that's really interesting about our short-term working memory is, first of all, we can only focus on one thing at a time. That's why we shouldn't multitask. But a really interesting phenomenon with our short-term working memory is we can actually focus on visual and verbal information at the same time. It's called dual coding. And so that's something where when you think about now, then the power of using visualizations in the classroom or describing something for kids, you're walking them through the process. They're seeing the process. They're hearing it explained. So we found a lot of strategies that really kind of relate to that dual coding idea. The other thing we know about short-term working memory is that we can only juggle so many items at once too. And so there's a moment where we're going to need to pause and process our learning. That kind of comes to the next phase. But one other thing about that is it's cognitive bandwidth. And so sometimes when we're trying to focus on new learning, if too much is coming at us at once, we struggle. Or if there are words we don't know, right, then we're completely lost, right? If I was trying to read an article on cricket, for example, I would be lost. I know the words, I don't know what they mean. And so that's where we see the power of like vocabulary instruction, not about just having kids like rotely memorize words, but understand the concept. And now here's a word that takes all those ideas and distills it into a simple packet of information called a word, right? So
I kind of learned that as a hockey coach when I was coaching hockey, is that when I started out as a coach, in between periods, you get to go to the dressing room and you tell the kids what they need to do. And when they used to come off, I'd be like, okay, look, the defenseman, you're going up too far. You're not staying in position. Forwards, I want you to forecheck harder, and I want you to make sure there's somebody out in front of the net at all times. And then you have to out hustle. You guys are not hustling hard enough. And I'd give them all this information, and they eventually might remember the first thing. And then when I shifted to more zoning in on, okay, here's the next thing you need to do to improve. Here's what I want: win the battle with the other person. That's all you have to focus on. And I focused in on one little thing. I was a lot more effective as a coach. Still didn't.
I've done the same thing. Yeah, I try to teach my daughter skiing. Like you throw a million things at them, like, knees together, bend your knees, like spaced downhill. And then after a while, they're like, it was not a good father-daughter moment, right? So,
well, you've made up for it, so it's okay. So what about make sense of learning? That's the fourth phase.
Yeah, and that gets to another thing we know about short-term working memory. There's lots of limitations of our short-term working memory. One of it is right there in the title. It's short-term, right? So we tend to find that after concerted effort, our brains want a timeout, and that's like 5 to 10 minutes. I see the same thing for adults, right? Sometimes people say, "Oh, it's 20 minutes." I usually don't have to look at my watch if I know I've gone on too long and people need to process. So what we do at those moments, we need to sort of shift what's happening. Like again, we can only keep our brains turned on for a limited amount of time. But when we pause and process and take a brain break, ideally what we're doing is we're starting now to connect what we've just heard, to consolidate the learning. That's the psychology term, right? Consolidation. We're taking the new disparate bits of information, maybe clustering them, categorizing them, turning it into a sequence, or connecting it back to prior learning. And so at that phase of learning, that's where we want to engage students, maybe in peer groups, right, where there's a question that gets posed to them. They're now answering that question. Actually, questions themselves are a powerful way to support consolidation. We want to ask questions that make students think about what they've learned. Daniel Willingham is a cognitive scientist. He makes that point. Students only learn what they think about. So we want to have those questions that are going to make kids think about what they've just learned and process it. Or if they're learning a skill, procedural knowledge, try that skill now in front of the teacher. And that's where we can then be observing and saying, oh, hey, are you missing a step here? Or we can see what their misconceptions might be and make sure that, they're not developing bad habits or misconceptions before the cement dries on their learning too. So that's really that fourth phase of learning. And sometimes we hear if we haven't done that for students, they walk out of the classroom like, that doesn't make sense to me, right? They're telling us I haven't been able to consolidate the learning in any way that I can grab onto. So we know the power of pausing and processing. I also know the temptation. I do this myself, sometimes presenting. You're looking at the clock, you're thinking like, I've only got 10 minutes left. I should just power on through the end. And you do that, you make the mistake of not giving people time to pause and process what they're doing. So we find the same thing I'm sure you do too, Jim, in workshops. We pause, we let teachers talk to one another, reflect. Sometimes writing is a great way also to consolidate your learning. So this is where our point also isn't that direct instruction is bad. Direct instruction sometimes is the most direct way to teach something. But if it's only direct instruction for like 50 minutes, well, our brains still want to take that moment to pause and process. So we may go on teaching, but our students aren't going to go on learning.
Well, it's probably not that it's direct instruction. It's probably that there's a lack of variety. I had lunch with my daughter, Emily, when she was in her senior year, before she went on to graduate school. And I said, so how's it going? How are the classes going? And she said to me, if I have to think, pair, share one more time, I'm going to puke.
Right.
If you do think, pair, share over and over again, and that's all you do, it's going to have the same kind of impact as direct instruction all the time over and over again. There's a lack of variety. And I have this theory, you can tell me it's unscientific, but it's just my theory. But as a presenter, that there are different ways of processing information with your brain, and you need to shake them up. So there's the way you listen to direct instruction. There's the way you talk to a partner. There's a way you watch a video. There's a way you discuss a case. There's a way you do planning. And you can tell me this, I'm sure this is unscientific, but in my experience, when people watch a video, that experience is more energizing than just another turn to your neighbor. But if you have a video, that's one kind of thinking. Planning is, but if you spend all day planning, by the afternoon, you're like, I think I've planned out. I think I'm done. So you have to kind of shake up the various ways in which you do it. I don't know if that fits with the research, but that's my personal experience.
Yeah. I think, when you watch a video, also you're getting that dual coding. I'm getting visual and verbal information. It's easier on my brain. But your point too, and we make this point too, that you need to mix it up. That's also something that re-engages our curiosity, some novelty. So if I'm only think, pairing, sharing, in fact, we caution against think, pair, share ad nauseum, right? Because people, they do want to throw up in their mouths, like one more think, pair, share. Can I do something different? And sometimes it might just be, we also know there's folks who are like, I am talked out, right? But if I could sit here quietly and reflect on something, I could do that. If I could stare out the window, and this is what I've just learned, or maybe I get up and move around or do something different. Or sometimes it's like, you just pause the mini lesson and say, I want to tell you a funny story that illustrates this, right? That can be enough of novelty, enough switching things up. So our brains are always looking for that variety because, again, that's what we are. Our brains are actually attuned to being stimulated by something that's different, out of the ordinary. It was actually probably a survival technique for us at one point to pay attention to something different today. There's I like to use like the example of like, it wasn't that there was a tree on the savannah that was important. It was that today, because that tree is always there. Today, there's a lion under the tree, so I'm going to pay attention to that. So our brains are always attuned to novelty, something different. So yeah, absolutely mixing things up, doing things that are different. Yeah. So as you pause and process, you want to make it something different each time, probably.
So the fifth thing really gets to the pause and process. Fifth is practice and reflect. Tell us more about this phase.
Yeah. And so as we think about now learning, moving from your short-term working memory into long-term memory, which is how we store information, we know there's really only one way to do that. And that's really through repetition. And there's actually a neuroscience component to this where we know every time you go back to a previous memory, you kind of trigger your brain to wrap a substance around it called myelin, right? So it's myelination is the fancy term. But it's kind of a fatty substance that basically makes that neuron, it's almost like insulation on the neuron, makes it fire together. more rapidly, more effectively. So if we know that to be true, and the only way you can really get a neuron to be really stable and solid is repetition, that's kind of the key thing. So I know that sounds like, oh, that's rote learning. Is that drill and kill? It's not exactly, because what we also need to be doing is, as we are learning, we're reflecting on our learning. But there's some interesting things here that we learned from cognitive science. Retrieval practice, basically being quizzed on something. If I have to rack my brain to remember something, I'm more likely to recall it. And so we also tell folks, like, you should quiz more and grade less. Like, we always think a quiz is something that goes in my grade book, but I do this in workshops. We pause, we process. Hey, what were the 5 things we just talked about? Go back to your memory, and it will reinforce that. So, but the other key thing here too, sometimes this is where, as kids are practicing something, they start to realize they're struggling with it. So we can also have like targeted supports here, where we say, we're going to create a new mini lesson, go back and repeat something that maybe didn't sink in the first time. And so that's kind of key, is to build foundational knowledge and skills. We've got to repeat that memory. The other piece, Jim, is like, it's repetition spaced over time. So, cramming, which I know we all did in college, really doesn't work, because cognitive scientists make the point, it's fast learning leads to fast forgetting. So it's having those relearning episodes spread over time helps that myelin form in our brains, makes those neural connections stronger. So that's the practice and reflect phase. And it leads to the next phase we'll talk about in a second, the extend and apply. So.
Well, I'm thinking it's very important to practice and reflect the right things.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not just practicing and reflecting, but you have to say, these are the primarily skills that kids need to be able to demonstrate. We're going to focus on this. Like, back to hockey, my kids had a hockey coach who used to do the same practice, the same breakout routine over and over again. And parents were like, well, why are the kids not just playing and having more fun? And I asked my son, I said, like, how do you feel about this? He said, Dad, I can close my eyes and shoot the puck down the ice, and I know the guy's going to be there.
Yeah.
So the fact that they had learned these high priority things, how to get the puck out of the zone, they'd practice it over and over and over again, was important. But if they'd spent all kinds of time on something trivial, it wouldn't have been helpful. They zoned in on one of the most important things. And so I think for a teacher to identify, these are my priority skills I really want to make sure the kids have, and then practice. You wouldn't have a basketball coach that says, okay, you've learned how to free throw, we're not going to practice it anymore. They're going to keep practicing various aspects of the game to get really skilled. And we've talked about the talent code as one book that talks about that, because the really skilled, you've got to practice to get good.
Yeah. And there's another interesting thing about practice, is that it's called mixed practice or interleaving practice, where during those practice sessions, we may be trying, you're shooting the basketball from different distances. Actually helps you learn how to shoot from one distance better, because it makes our brains have to toggle back and forth between a slight change in what we're doing. Same thing applies to declarative knowledge. Like, they've done studies like with art appreciation. If I'm only looking at Monet paintings, my brain starts to go, yada, 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 this is Monet. But if I'm mixing in Monet with Matisse and, Van Gogh, now my brain has to go back and forth, like, what are the characteristics of a Monet versus a Van Gogh? So that idea of mixed practice is really powerful too. A lot of teachers don't do it, right? We just say, okay, work on, problems 21 through 40 in the book tonight that are all the same kind of problem, instead of like introducing something from the last unit or something else we've been learning during this unit. So there's a lot of things we've learned about how to make practice really powerful too.
So last is extend and apply. Why is that important? And what are some quick suggestions on how we can get kids to do that?
Yeah. So we can go back to cognitive science on this. What we know is that if you've learned something only one way or in one setting, you're more likely to forget it, or you might store that information, but you can't always retrieve it. We've all had that problem, right? Something on the tip of your tongues that like somebody's name, you've met them before, but maybe only met them at one conference one time. And so, but as soon as they tell you their name, like, oh yeah, I knew that, right? That tells us we stored the information, we just didn't have enough hooks to retrieve it. So what we're trying to do is help kids have multiple retrieval hooks to their learning. Well, the best way to do that is, it's repetition, but it's the repetition can be, now I've taken that information and I'm trying to apply it. I've learned a math formula, now I'm trying to apply it in real life. Or I've learned, a new writing skill, and now I have a chance to actually, I'm trying to defend an argument and I'm using that new writing skill. Or I've learned about a period of history, but now I'm trying to build an argument about it, or, to write about what I've learned. And so what we're trying to do is create more complex learning opportunities for students. And usually that almost always means going beyond just the summative test. Because again, if all I'm doing is learning how to answer a multiple choice test, I'm only learning about history or science in one way with one application. So what we see is there's a lot of powerful things, strategies around like guided investigations or structured problem solving, or we call it cognitive writing, where we engage in writing about what we've learned. I don't know about you, Jim. I think that's the thing gets lopped off in a lot of unit planning, right? Like we just end with the test, we move on to the next unit, and then kids forget 90% of what they've learned, So I think it's a really powerful strategy. And again, that's the kind of thing I think for a lot of teachers, they feel like that's a nice to have. Oh, it'd be great to do a project, but I don't have time for that. What I think the cognitive science and what the science of teaching is showing is that actually that's a need to have. If you want your students to truly retain information, be able to store it and retrieve it, they need to engage in deep learning with it.
Mm-hmm. I think we would have called this in my day, and I was around in 1966. But anyway, we would have called it generalization. I think is talking about how or transfer, and there's much more sophisticated than that. But that's the key thing. Now, does an excellent teacher need to implement all 6 phases?
Yes, but not in a single lesson, right? So we make that point too. It's really more about unit design. And you're thinking, again, you kind of go back to the standards and say, okay, what's the essential knowledge, the enduring understandings, whatever you want to call that, the big ideas that I want my kids to get? And how do I then anchor the learning in that extend and apply? But then you got to back it up, right? There's going to be foundational knowledge and skills they're going to have to learn through repetition or to solidify through repetition. They got to make sense of what they're learning. They need to encounter that new learning in ways that support ready acquisition of knowledge. And then they need to set a goal for it and how to do something to get them interested in the first place. So it's kind of, you could use a backward design approach to this. So we would say yes to units, right? But not necessarily, you're not trying to do this, obviously, every lesson. That would be kind of a drive-by approach to doing this.
So I wanted to say just a little bit about what we've been doing. Yeah. And then just see if you have any comments. So what we've been doing is we've been saying, okay, let's go through the 6 phases and let's talk about the 14 teaching strategies. And then we were saying, okay, if I implement that strategy, what should be helping for students? And we've been trying to identify, for example, I would like my kids to be more persistent. I'd like to be more interested in learning, to look at the first stages, or I'd like them to apply their learning in other contexts. And so our institute we're going to do in Lawrence, Kansas, Taylor Swift's favorite city. What we're going to do is we're going to talk people through the process of how do you help teachers identify those goals? Then how do you help teachers learn the strategies? And then the goals become sort of objective standards of impact. Mm-hmm. If the strategy works, we should see a change in students, which means the teachers will learn inherent and like intrinsically to create to use the strategy effectively. And it's really taking the impact cycle and applying it and saying, how will we take your research and put it into our process we call the impact cycle? So I wondered, another leading question, but any thoughts about the process we did the last couple of days and what we're working on?
Yeah, what I'm really excited about it too, Jim, is it's like we are also applying the 6 phases of learning to how teachers learn, right? So we're going to help them think about, what's your problem of practice in the classroom? What's the biggest thing you want to do? Because now you're curious, right? Like, how would I get my kids to be more persistent or focus more, whatever it might be? And then set that goal, learn something new, go have a chance to make sense of it. I'm applying it in my classroom. I'm getting some coaching. So as I do my repetitions with it, I'm getting some feedback. And then eventually what we know is teachers are going to take that idea and I'm going to meld it onto something else. I'll extend it. I'll do, the transfer of it. So that's what I'm really excited about. I love what we've been coming up with too, Jim, around each of the 14 strategies, being able to think about, well, what's different for kids? How will I, why am I doing this? What should I see in my students? And it's not just always academic outcomes, right? Maybe they're more engaged or something's happening that we know is a important precondition or, a leverage point for good learning too. So I'm really excited about this because also we do know from research, right, that learning when teachers are doing professional learning, most of their professional learning doesn't stick either, right? The research is pretty dismal around professional learning unless you can have coaching or opportunities to work with peers to really get that to stick in my build that into my repertoire of practices.
The other thing I really like about it is that we're like this week is probably the first time I felt like I know how now I would go about addressing school-wide goals and individual coaching, because your model, your 14 evidence-based practices and the 6 phases, that gives you a way to do a comprehensive model for instruction. And then the coaching says, well, for this teacher, this teacher might not need to work on curiosity on the part of kids, but they might want to work on something else. And so you can individualize support at the same time as you have a school-wide goal.
Yeah.
And that's been a mystery for me a long time, but I really feel like this week it came clear thanks to working with you.
Yeah, I was excited about that too. And we kind of realized, oh, this is sort of, one of our strategies is a guided investigation. What that means is we don't want to turn kids totally loose and say, just go research whatever you want to research, but teachers have a role. So that's the same thing. Instructional coaches have a role to say, we work on a practice that's meaningful to you, but we want to make sure that the practice you're working on is actually going to have an impact on kids, right? So yeah, you could focus on bulletin boards. That looks nice, but does it change anything for kids? And so that's not to knock bulletin boards. Maybe I have some bitter memories of being told my bulletin boards weren't great enough. But we want to make sure what they're working on is truly high leverage and it's going to have an impact. And that, again, like now you can have your school rowing in the same direction, even though you may be in different parts of the boat, if you will.
I love it. I love it very much. Is there anything else you want to say about the research you describe in the new classroom instruction that works?
I think the other thing I always talk about is, because I know sometimes research can seem like a bummer. Like, like research tells you I should eat more kale salad or whatever, or go to spinning class. And it can feel like one more thing we're telling teachers you should do. But I think the whole idea, and what I get excited about this with, is that the more we can design learning to reflect how kids' brains work, and the more we can use teaching strategies that really accelerate their learning, the easier it is for them, the more joyful it is for them, and also for us. And so I think in the end, I feel like all of this is adding up to joyful learning experiences for kids and for teachers. And so I wouldn't want people to feel like this is going to be one more like drudgery, or it's going to feel like a graduate, level course. It's like, this is going to help. We all want to be great teachers, right? We all want to see the light bulbs go on for kids. And I think that's what this is ultimately all about, is that those joyful learning experiences.
I love it. More joy is a good idea. Thanks so much for the conversation, Bryan. Thank you for the partnership. I'm so thrilled to be a part of this conversation and working on this work. And I think it's going to be fun to see how it all evolves. We always say we want to have an unmistakable impact on the quality of kids' lives and on kids' learning. And I think this is a great way to move in that direction. So I'm grateful for our conversation. More importantly, I'm grateful for the work you've done. I think it's really, really wonderful.
Well, thank you, Jim. It's been a great conversation, and I'm so excited about the work we've got together. It's been I've been learning so much from you. And yeah, hope to see everybody in Lawrence, Taylor Swift's favorite city, but also the home of basketball, right? It's where basketball was invented. So, I'm surprised you didn't mention that, Jim.
Well, maybe not where it was invented, but the first coach was the inventor.
Okay, all right. So,
and he's the only losing coach at the University of Kansas was James Naismith, but the other 7 all have winning records. So, but this year wasn't a particularly good year, though. So we better not play it up. Well, both of us are suffering. Baylor,
right? We are suffering. Yeah. So, well, thank you, Jim. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Bryan.